First of all, I think your analysis was very straight line. History doesn't run in a straight line.
Kid, you cannot tell your neighbor he is stealing ducks when you are stealing frogs.
As High Commissioner, I was wrong. As Charandas Prasad, I reacted naturally how any person would have.
I did not come here for that kind of abuse. I did not come here for that kind of abuse. If you're going to go down that road, I'll walk off.
But it's all okay once they're talking. If they were talking, I could not have been here today.
You got ADHD.
I got nothing.
Calm down.
I think I've done enough in terms of taking our team out of trouble from losing.
Come on, Lou Taylor. That's good. I'm reading the script now, and the first person that comes to my mind to play a detective,
Yes,
but
the
an
Guyanese critic.
erratic
Mikhail
detective, is Mikhail Rodriguez.
Why an African slap an Indian? Why a man and slap a woman? Look, how you deal with that? You deal with that.
We must encourage platforms like this because it brings together different people and allows for discussions to take place in our country on a multiplicity of fundamental issues.
Kingdom, you apologizing for something you think I did is wrong. I don't want you to do that, and you should not have done that. Hi there. Welcome to the Freddie Kissoon Show. Wherever you are, it's good evening from Guyana, because it's evening in Guyana. Good morning if you're looking from London. Good afternoon, good morning, good night, wherever you are. This is the Freddie Kissoon Show. We are now 2 years and a few months. In our studio this evening is one of the Guyanese with a formidable intellect. You may not like his ideological, cultural / sociological, philosophical perspective. You may disagree with some of his ideological pathways. You may disagree with his interpretation of the cultural history of Guyana, but you cannot deny that in the Guyanese nationality, this is one of Guyana's most profound intellectuals. Our guest this evening is such a person, RAVI Dev. He needs no introduction. When you've been around social activism for more than 25 years, you need no introduction. He's been missing in the studio for a couple of months, and since then, a lot of things have happened. We're about a year into an election. So, without further ado, Ravi, welcome. And I read this thing and I said, we have to start with this because this is straight up your area now.
Well, thank you, Freddie. Let me say thank you to all your audience out there, and I hope we'll be able to discuss things of interest to them.
Sure. I'm putting this up on the screen. It's an eventful life by one of the most experienced third world international financial specialists. He is Guyanese, was one of the leading members of the WPA, then went into the United Nations and CARICOM. He is one of the third world's leading experts on international political economy. This is his autobiography, and he has something to say about Burnham. Now, when I read it, I said, Ravi Dev has to expatiate on that statement. I will read what Maurice Odell has to say, and then it's over to Ravi. Let me quote Maurice Odell. Burnham retorted, then you are a member of the PNC. Further nonplussed at the grand charge, my response was, I am neither a member of the PNC. For the next 40 minutes or so, Burnham wanted to know why I was not a member of the PNC and what I would recommend other than what the PNC was currently doing in order to better serve Guyana. This is Odell meeting Burnham in the early 60s after independence in London. In response, I took the opportunity to propose the power sharing strategy that the New World Group publication had recommended a few months earlier as being appropriate. Burnham responded that he was not prepared to go that route so early in his term of office, which began in 1964, and that was his African supporters expect, and what his African supporters expect was a period of consolidation and furtherance of their interests. Now, Odell and Burnham are talking in a hotel. Burnham said, why don't you come over to the PNC? Odell said, I'm not a PNC or PPP. Burnham said, wait, what ideas you have for my government? Odell said, power sharing. This is what Burnham said, and I'll read it again. Let's go back to the page. Burnham responded that he was not prepared to go that route so early in his term of office, which began in 1964, and that what his African supporters expect was a period of consolidation and furtherance of their interests. Did that happen, Ravi? You're as good a historian as anybody in the Guyanese nationality.
Well, there's a couple of things. One, Odell is talking to Burnham in London in 1966, the year of our independence.
Yeah.
So Burnham had just, as you said, got into power. And I think a couple of things are important here. One, Burnham is conceding that his base is African. While he's been touting the whole socialist, ideology of his party, that the PNC is socialist, and in socialism, one would look at class interests as paramount. Burnham is very honest with Maurice Odell to say that my supporters are A, African Guyanese, and B, I must look after their interest before everything else. So this is exactly what happened and what unfolded. Burnham implied as if at some point in time he would loosen the reins, so to speak, and involved other groups in whatever the government was geared towards producing. But it never happened, and I'll tell you why. Which is what the history tells you. Between 1964 and 1968, when that first election, post-independence election will occur, Burnham took over the rice industry, which was the largest employer of Indian Guyanese in Guyana. He proclaimed that all paddy had to be sold to the government. He controlled the rice marketing board, put in his own people there. In purchasing the paddy, he purchased it at extremely low prices. My nana, who I was raised with, we produced a small amount of paddy, but you had to sell it to the government. Then he created rice mills, mega mills, throughout Guyana, from Blackbush Polder, on the east coast, on the west coast, on Wakenham, on the Essequibo coast. All of these were controlled and manned by African Guyanese party members. So in a sense, he created a whole new bourgeoisie class who, as in the sugar industry of colonial times, one race ran the industry, controlled everything, while the other race were merely the workers. So Indians became impoverished because the paddy was sold at a certain price, which did not pay them. And within a decade, the rice industry was on its knees. It has been calculated, there's one study that shows you that during that time, the difference in what the paddy was bought for and what the paddy was sold abroad and the profits accumulated to the government for Burnham's own purposes amounted to an implicit tax of 110%. And going down to taking care of his supporters, because you're hearing a different story nowadays, as if African Guyanese or African Guyanese brothers, they were not ever economically empowered. In rice, Burnham, one of Jagan, the biggest mark against Jagan was that the Blackbush polder scheme that was opened up during his regime went predominantly to Indian Guyanese. Never mind that it was an open application form and that African Guyanese applicants got more in proportion to what their numbers in applying. They got more land. So Mr. Burnham, in all the new schemes, especially on Region 5, gave land to African Guyanese out of proportion to their numbers. So the rice industry was used to channel funds into the African Guyanese pockets. And we could go on with later. Burnham by 1970 would take over, would have something called the External Trade Bureau.
Yeah, ETB.
Where they took over all importation. So all these petty shops that the Indians owned had to purchase through them, but you couldn't purchase because he opened something called Knowledge Sharing Institute. And they were all located in African areas. So the whole of West Coast probably had two, one in Denamstel, one in my village of Kashmir in the African section. So that was another source of income that was taken away from Indo-Guyanese. The sugar industry, as you know, was nationalized and a levy was imposed. So after 100 years, sugar workers had won something called profit sharing. The Crane Commission of 1968, he had won a percentage of the profit. That the profits of the industry would be distributed in proportion to the numbers. Workers had 60% of the costs and management had 40%. So the profits were distributed to workers and management in terms of the rehabilitation of factories and so on. Burnham now imposed a levy which took away profit sharing from Indians. So, for example, my father, who worked as a security guard on the sugar estate, his first profit sharing was in 1960s, and they brought what it was called those days a 3-piece set. That was the first time we got all these leatherette type of things.
I know about that.
Everybody home, and we learned to sit on three-piece set. So you learn about a love seat, and you learn about that. So you could go on and on, Freddie, but what I'm saying, Mr. Burnham, and this is where some present ideologues, especially in the WPA, are talking about empowerment, and that as if African Guyanese were not also empowered, and that Burnham, even though he was socialist like Dr. Jagan, he understood politics and he took care of his supporters. My question, Freddie, and this is something that we ask, how come by 1992, when we had the first household income and expenditure survey, African Guyanese and Indian Guyanese were economically on par? If all of this wealth was drained out of the Indian section of the economy and placed into African pockets, how come they did not use that wealth to then rise further, move up? I think that's an important question, because and I think right now we are facing that same question in the present conjuncture as to whether we're going to just put money into people's pockets and not worry about what that money will be used for and how we will move ahead. And I'm not making any value judgment. I think it's a matter that we have to deal with. It's not just a matter of handing money to people. We have to look at, cultural aspects and all that. Kimani Nehusi, your old friend Drake from
Francis Drake,
talks a lot about this. And I think that's an element where our WPA friends don't talk enough about. They simply play the blame game. Now, if you just throw money at African Guyanese, that will solve the problem.
When I read that, I said I have to ask. When I read what Udo said, I said I have to ask you because I wanted to get from you. I expected to get from you what I got right now, in that you have painted a canvas of these people were empowered. So the cry of discrimination now rings hollow, because not only did the government empower them, but the government guillotined Indian interests, and there was a transfer. And that, I think, that adumbration needs to be repeated ad nauseam. It needs to be told, and I've written about it. What happened 40, 50, 60 years ago? Didn't we have African empowerment?
Well, you see, I was towards the end when I returned to Guyana and, started activism and all that, Haslem Paris, and I got on very well. A great intellect, one of the Paris is noted for being intellectuals out of Buxton. So Haslem and I spoke because Burnham had put Haslem in charge of the bauxite industry, which had been nationalized even before. So here was nationalization where all of the management of the bauxite industry was given over to African Guyanese. But what happened is that, and this is an explanation of part of what happened, that when they were given allowance the permission to run the industry and the authority to run that industry, and Haslem was up there, the supporters of the PNC who worked there felt they could do anything. So during those years, in the first few years of the bauxite nationalization, they produce surpluses. Production rose, surpluses in terms of finances were produced. But what was happening, they were not using part of the funds to rehabilitate and maintain the factory. Maintenance is important in any mechanical device. It will run down. So within a decade, production started to plummet, both from the plants not being replenished, everybody thinking they're bosses, doing their own thing, because you had all kinds of workers, council running things and what have you. It was not run on strict business principles. So even after the alumina plant was shut down, and the alumina plant, it needed electricity. That's why they had an electricity generating plant. Even though it was shut down, so it doesn't justify the electricity anymore. The electricity was kept going to give the people of Linden free electricity from the 60s. So from the 70s, free, because they were getting it already, but even when the plant closed down, it continued to be free. The point is, in Haslem's estimation, the political directorate interfered too much. What they thought, they were empowering their people, but they were not working on strict business lines, in strict commercial criteria in terms of profitability, in terms of making decisions as to what to close and what not to close. And so I think, Freddie, what we have to look at in the present is that part of the reason was Burnham's politicization of all of the 80% of the economy that he boasted about controlling. That 80% was put in the hands of his supporters. They lived high off the hog, and the ordinary people, eventually, of both races suffered, because eventually, if the industrial structure falls apart, everybody's going to suffer. And then we have of course, by the 70s, people like Mr. Guyanna now saying what has happened to Afro-Guyanese, that Burnham has sold out to the Portuguese and Indian business class. But I'll give you something in sugar. I'm from the sugar belt. I live in Iflat. I still live in Iflat. I still live in the lot that my father got when he came out of the low G's of Iflat. I still live there. And for example, I was abroad, but I used to return home annually. And the factory manager of Iflat, the administrative manager of Iflat, was a fellow named Tony Downs. And Tony Downs ran Iflat, right? Like his personal fiefdom. The factory manager, a fellow named Charles, did his own thing. So what they did was to enrich themselves using the state machinery, they put their own people with you. You're asking the people about, we were talking earlier off camera about people putting, square pegs in round holes. The same thing happened on every industry. And I know after my husband told me about bauxite, I know about sugar, where all of these people were not qualified for the job. And then they used it for their own benefit. I had two brothers who were apprentices at Eifert Estate.
Had they not around?
They're wrong. Meaning, they're abroad.
Oh, that time you had two brothers.
Yeah, they were here. And they both told me of instances of such flagrant use of the assets of the sugar estate, state assets for their personal benefits, that when you talk about people living ostentatiously nowadays, you don't know the half of it as to what happened. There was, at that point, I was told at the Leonora, there was a guest house for.
Yeah, I know the Leonora.
The little guest house.
Yes,
you have the big ones would go there and have a grand old time. That guest house was used for the wedding of the daughter of one of the directors of Gaisuko, right? And it was raining.
That's factual?
Factual, I'm telling
so
you.
So you don't want to call his name?
I'll be honest with you, the name doesn't come to my mind right now. It's not Barrow, it's another very big name.
No, Comet Barrow was bauxite.
Bauxite, but the name doesn't come to my mind right now. And my brother was an electrician who had to go and fix up all of what would be, the house, bring it up to date. But as it was raining, they used over 300 bags of urea, sand to cover the road, so the bride and groom could walk from the public road to the guest house as if in snow.
Which would remain the most expensive wedding walkway in Guyanese.
Exactly. Forget about red carpet. Talk about
the red carpet would not be as expensive.
Talk about white
red
urea.
Carpet is stuff that looks nice, but
it exemplifies the use of the state, where Mr. Burnham created an upper strata for the middle class Afro-Guyanese community, and then of course I haven't even gotten in to the other classes of the Guyanese, which is, for example, where the co-op movement was supposed to take care of them. Mr. Burnham took care of his constituency. Co-ops were formed.
Mr. Burnham empowered African Guyanese.
Empowered them, and I think I always complain that how come they're not praising this man more for specifically that, for for example, all the co-ops, Freddie, and you would know that. Even the Georgetown ones that took care of rear pigs and all of that, they were given piglets, they were given money to put up the structures, the pens, they were given tractors. Every co-op. Now, the entrepreneurs, talking about entrepreneurs, the Guyana National Cooperative Bank was set up to give loans to entrepreneurs.
And you have the Ghana Mortgage Finance Bank.
But I'm talking entrepreneurial now. That they said Mr. Burnham, being socialist, didn't build an entrepreneurial class. You go when GNCB went bankrupt by 1990.
A whole set of African guys.
There was a list that was put out as to who owned what. Talk about
the
Kampala.
same would be with the Mortgage Finance Bank too. The same would be.
Same. There would be something put out. But I remember this because I was allowed to see that list, and I remember Jocelyn Dow had because she was an activist at that time. She had a company that made Liana furniture or something like that. Kampala restaurant. These are things that I still come to my mind. But you were talking of big money that was offered. Not interest-free, but at low interest, and they were never repaid. That is why GNCB went bankrupt, and billions had to be written off. Now, those billions, Freddie, are probably trillions in today's money.
So WPA and Eric Phillips and them are saying, empower us again. In fact, that's what they're saying again.
And that is what they're saying, but they're not admitting it again. They're saying they were never. They are making a line from emancipation to today as if it's an unbroken line of unmitigated suffering and oppression and all that, forgetting what Mr. Burnham and Mr. Hoyt did in their 28 years. I'll tell you a story about Mr. Hoyt. I was very close, and I always refer to him as Mr. Hoyt. Right? We got very close because I was in the opposition.
You and Hoyt?
He liked the intellectual thing.
Yeah, but he would never have been in Parliament because he was the president. So you would not have seen him in Parliament.
No, but he would call, for example, when we had to get a new head of GCOM. He called me and he said, Ravi, I know you don't talk to the PPP and all that, but I don't know who to call. I'm thinking of somebody and I want you to float their name. And he called me. I said, who's the person? He says, Steve Surridge Valley. Right? True story. And because I was in Parliament in 2001 and all that. So I said, who do I know? Now, I only knew one of the few persons I know was Kemraj Ramjatan. Because when I returned to Guyana, Dr. Jagan had sent Kemraj to watch one of my activities, and I got to know Kemraj since then, in 1988. Anyhow, I called Kemraj. And I said, man, Mr. Hoyt would, want to nominate Steve Surridge Valley. What do you all think? And blah, blah, blah. He went around. He must have spoken to whoever he had to speak to. And I told Mr. Hoyt, yes, they were okay with Steve. And Steve came back. But the point I want to make...
Wait. Steve Surridge Valley knows that the origin of his chairmanship of GCOM started with you?
Later, when we got to Gaffin and all
so
that.
He knew that?
Yeah, later he knew that. Not sorry with me, sorry Mr. Hoyt. But I was
Hoyt had it had to start with Hoyt.
But I want to show you the closeness that Mr. Hoyt, he in a sense, he agreed because Hoyt fancied him, not fancied, that is like a deprecating word. No, Hoyt was an intellectual and he saw himself as such. He liked to read. So he and I would talk a lot about books. He liked history. He did his first degree in history, and he liked it. So to come back to one of the anecdotes he told me, right, was that he said, Ravi, when Barama decided to come to Guyana, right, to open up this plywood factory and all that, their logging concessions were in Northwest District. And of course, they wanted to put their factory in the Northwest District. So you don't have to be hauling logs literally hundreds of miles. He said, I persuaded them, nay, I insisted that they placed that factory up in Garden of Eden, somewhere down there, up the East Bank, towards as you go there. The Barama factory was up there, right? And what he told me, because we were talking about this whole need of how do you have entrepreneurship, how do you get ahead? The same question that you and I are discussing between the two groups is the things they balance. So he himself tried to empower Afro-Guyanese on the East Bank or in Georgetown who worked to get a job there. And lo and behold. But what he told me, he said, Ravi, even though they started the factory, the people came back and told me that every Friday and Saturday night, the workers jumping the fence to go partying, that they would not. I told you. Hoyt told me that they did not want to put up with that discipline of the South Koreans, what got South Korea where it is today, of 3 shifts and you work your shift. In fact, as you know, in South Korea, they have to now pass a law, and Japan, to insist that people leave. You can't keep on working beyond your hours. So Mr. Hoyt, that was one of his things. And if you go back to the 1988 Genesis of the Nation speeches, right? Our boy Ramphel had his speech about Indians in early in the year, and Mr. Hoyt had his speech. And in fact, Mr. Ramphel alluded to Mr. Hoyt as his colleague, former colleague, because that was 1988. So Mr. Hoyt in his speech is something that every Guyanese should read, but especially African Guyanese. It's called Beyond the Horizon. And he said part of the problem of African Guyanese that is not recognized by most of the leaders is that because coming out of slavery, he quoted Orlando Patterson quotation that Afro-Guyanese suffered what he calls social death. A lot of their institutions that came out of Africa were destroyed and they suffered social death. But one of the results also was what he called they did not look beyond the horizon, meaning to look farther ahead. They looked for the immediate future. Now, economists would use terms like, immediate gratification and all that, but that's too flip. Hoyt made a profound observation as a historian that unlike Indo-Guyanese, who say, man, me do this, who me pick me, and me do this, and you keep on looking down the road, that African Guyanese look too much into the present, and they have to lift up their heads and look beyond the horizon. So coming back to today, we had a party called ROAR, we called for affirmative action for those who are, depressed and what have you. But it can't be just handing out jobs without ensuring or helping them to understand their role. They must be given agency, Freddie. This is what is happening. People like my friend David Hines and your friend David Hines, they refuse to accept the need for agency, in charting our life course. You just can't give people handouts, give people $5,000 US a year and expect them to do.
He's going to react to this interview.
I hope so. I've been trying to get him to talk about this. One of his students.
He's too far gone, I think.
One of his students became one of his students who passed through him, and then she passed through Hinson's person, and she got her PhD, and she has written a remarkable book about what is called culturalism, which David, I asked him, I said, read your own student?
What's the name of that book?
I forget what it's called, but the point of it was her dissertation that she put into book
But it's
form.
not on Guyana.
No, this is something from America. They were University of South, she finished at Arizona.
It has the word caste in it.
I'm pretty sure because coming out of thing, but what it is that the point she's making that there are certain activists who are totally focused on the cultural and are not connecting that cultural to economics. That economics has a whole body of work called behavioral economics that talks about your behavior. You just can't dismiss it and talk about only systemic factors as if you're suddenly, being manipulated like a puppet and you have no agency. This is, and I tell you, Freddie, I come back and I'll call David's name again. I fear for what David is doing to the African Guyanese today, to those who listen to him.
I mean, the man, a Guyanese woman named Gita Chandan, upbraid an African for derogating Indian people. And because he called the woman a slave catcher, I mean,
But it goes beyond that, Freddie. He and I have had this debate already. I'll tell you, this is part of that danger. My point is that, okay, in plural societies, even if it's not plural, ideology can split society, and in that sense it becomes ideologically plural. You had left and right, even in England. But I want to say this, that you see, the point is that by David now defining our groups in here in such a manner that an Indian Guyanese cannot comment on the action on an African Guyanese, even when it affects him or her. You are a slave catcher, because to now criticize one of their party members who derogated Indians, spoke very disparaging of Indians, and not only her, of Ganesh Mahipal. There were 3 slave catchers. Ganesh was one, Gita was the other, and Mayor Ubraj was the third. They're all slave catchers. So it led to, in David's point, and I hope this doesn't spread, he is saying...
No, he hasn't got that traction.
No, what he's saying is that don't bother to go outside of your ethnic group for next election, because you're wasting your time. It's not going to happen. Now, my point is, Freddie, is that...
So he's saying... don't look for crossover votes. Don't look for, is what he said?
Yes.
In this multicultural, multi-ethnic...
He has explicitly said that. But this is the important point. You see, when you look for crossover votes,
Nigel,
as you know, I'm going to bring Nigel, because my thing, as you know, I'm not PPP. Never been, you get me, still not PPP, whether a member or a supporter or whatever you. But the point is, my point is that the PPP, he's calling them slave catchers, like Gita Chandan, for seeking crossover votes. Now, my point is that I don't want to get into the too much intellectualism about it, but in seeking crossover votes, you have to moderate your rhetoric, Freddie. So in a plural society, you're not cussing down every day. And that, hopefully, over time, can lead to some kind of rapprochement.
But when you can cuss down and do all those things, but you're doing it and you're asking people to vote for you. David Hines is now presidential candidate of the WPA.
But what he has done is to divide, and this is again the ossification of ethnicity, that he doesn't want to break it down. His thesis is that the PNC under Aubrey Norton will get your regular African votes. Nigel Hughes, my good friend Nigel Hughes, will get the middle class African votes. Or middle class votes.
And David will get
David will get the radical votes. All 10 of them.
All 10.
And all 10 are outside of Guyana, including the guy who called for beheadings. He's out of Georgia. You understand?
Yeah. But if David is delineating that electoral contest that way, if he's going to get the radical, he's going to end up probably getting 5 or 10 votes. So how much votes?
But that's why he's calling for a coalition. So I don't know how.
Coalition between whom?
AFC, PNC, and WPA.
The same old story.
But on the new premises, and that is why they are cussing Aubrey every day of the week for not supporting street protests, when Aubrey knows that street protests end up with violence against East Indians, and that doesn't get him anywhere, or get the party anywhere, or get the country anywhere. Yet every day they cuss him out because of that.
But Hines is not in Guyana. Hines, if Norton say, yes, let's go on the street, where is Hines?
Well, that's another story.
There was a protest for the Palestinians at Hines University, and he wasn't in the demonstration.
But I don't want to personalize this. I want to keep it focused on our reality here. But I
want to ask you, what Hines said to you about the African ontological view, that still obtains would you say that the way Hoyt described or analyzed the African way of seeing life in the Genesis of the Nation speech, you still see that as obtaining?
I think it has altered tremendously since Mr. Hoyt spoke in 1988, August, actually end of July. And I think it's an empirical question now that we have to test, and elections will test that. I believe, and I can only go by my own interactions in my own village of Iflat, where there's an African section called Kashwa.
Yeah, I know that place well. I have relatives.
Right.
My wife had relatives there.
Where there's a group in there that is very supportive of the PPP. And guess who is the coordinator of that group in there? Tandai McAllister, James' niece, who's born in Iflat. She's a lawyer, a very qualified lawyer. And she has a group of young Africans in Kashwa, you get me, who are talking about development of Kashwa. So when Irfan went through Kashwa with her in attendance, and then they gave them funds for 50 chicken farms. Those were 50 Africans in Iflat section, the Kashwa section of Iflat, who will now become entrepreneurs. And that has happened in Denham still. That has happened, I can talk of what I know on West Coast, whether it's Dikendren or Varganuchan. The point is that you have a new cohort of young Africans. And there are some others from the older generation too, but they are harder not to crack. But the young African generation are seeing, and they like to use the word their lived experience. In their lived experiences, opportunities are presenting themselves, right? to them that they can then grasp. So, for example, in the webpage for the IMI flood run by McAllister, young McAllister, today there was something about they have about 500 spots open for training in welding, in masonry, and all these
But
things.
isn't that what Ipadiji was supposed to do?
Freddie, you tried to provoke me, or what? You.
That's what Ipadiji do. But Nigel Hughes is a topic in Guyana since he, and you said you come to Nigel Hughes. Come to Nigel Hughes about what? What you want to say about Nigel Hughes?
Well, Nigel has, I know Nigel for the last 20 plus odd years, and in Roar's early life, Nigel happened to reach out and lend his legal assistance to a member of the group, and we got close since then. And he did it gratis, pro bono, and all that. And since then, because we talk about things. I know that Nigel is very concerned also about the African Guyanese
Well, his
condition.
politics the past 4 years went in that direction.
Right, and but he's always been. I don't know if you know, Mr. Hoyt is his godfather.
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, but he's not a member of the PVNC, and as he has always said publicly, the Hughes and the PNC, really never saw eye to eye. So they were never Burnhamites or all of that. So we have to understand like the context of out of which Nigel arises. Yes, he's middle class and all that, but he's not been out of the belly of the beast, so to speak, of the PNC, if you want to call it that lines. He's been having to observe from the outside. But again, he's very concerned about the African Guyanese condition. And I think every African, all Guyanese ought to be, but based on how we play politics, ought to also be concerned. Now, Nigel, even though initially he appeared on a lot of the WPA programs and all that, I was very happy to see him in his mobilizing attempts. The first place he came out to was in Leonora Market. My wife shops in Leonora Market every Saturday. You understand? Mm-hmm. It's a very mixed community with a preponderance of Indians. And Nigel was well received by everybody. So unlike what the radical, like David Hines are talking about, Nigel now is not looking at this thing as slave catching. And I used the phrase, I said, if you're going to call Indians who recruit Afro-Guyanese into a party as slave catchers, should Indians call Nigel Arkati? The Arkati were the people who recruited Indians and fooled them to come. No, Nigel is reaching across. So coming back to, after Roar folded, I would go around the country every now and then. And my last trip was up the Esquibo Coast. And the people from the AFC, the activists who came out of Roar and had crossed over to the AFC, all of them to a man speak glowingly of Nigel Hughes and not Kemraj Ramdachan, nor my friend Trotman.
Yeah, I could understand.
That is the
Trotman, oh my goodness, I can understand.
Or Nigel, or Kemraj.
Right,
so
right.
people think that, it's an Indian thing. So I am saying that while I don't think that Nigel, because of our polarized politics, especially being polarized by people like Hines and others, that I don't think that if Nigel runs on its own, because I'm not so sure how successful he will be, because he'll be pulling votes from traditional PNC votes.
I found him to be intellectually profound person. And I couldn't understand why, for the past 4 years, he drifted into that African, and in the company of people who would turn off Portuguese and turn off Indian people. I mean, I thought as I read his things and he went into Buxton, delivered things and said, if you don't come to the table, we will break the table legs. I thought he had drifted into that. And he was staying there. And then he became leader of the AFC. And I thought that 4 years of Africanization of his politics would hurt him. this is a multiracial country. You must always appeal to sound multiracial.
Well, as I said, David has rejected that, and the WPA, they have rejected that. All these, and I would assume all these elders like Odell and C. White Thomas and all that, who never knew race back in the day, now are now approving this. But coming back to Nigel, I have thought a lot, because again, speaking to Mr. Hoyt and what have you, Mr. Hoyt, of course, argued with me publicly in the Starbuck News. At that time, he didn't see Afro-Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese, and what was this guy Ravi Dev talking about. But he came around in delving into it, and he was an introspective individual. And he came around to understanding that, to a great extent, coming back to his speech and what have you, that we must address the problem along those lines. But coming back to Nigel, in 1965, Sir Arthur Lewis, Nobel Prize winning economist Arthur Lewis, coming out of the Oxford universities, he wrote a book, Politics in West Africa, talking about how do you deal with the politics in plural societies, right? And this is when M.G. Smith had already been doing his work in the Caribbean, but Arthur Lewis comes back, and of course he'd be the one who tried to save the Federation. But by 65, he writes his book, and he talks about Guyana. And there's two sentences I've never forgotten. He said, when you talk about democracy, right, he talks about two options in a plural society. One, coalitions, and two, federalism. Many of people like Eric Phillips and others and David talk about coalition, but they never mention federalism. But that's not the point I want to make. To come back to Nigel, there's another sentence in which Arthur Lewis writes, and he was a man totally British in his outlook, talking about a colonial man. He says that if upon counting heads are the Africans of, and he said the Negroes, in those days they would use the word Negro. If upon counting heads are the Negroes of British Guyana to be exterminated. So I looked at this great intellectual, and I lived in Guyana. I was here in 64, 65. Yes, we had riots. Yes, we had all that. But to use that very strong word, exterminated, it implies to me, it showed me that while and this is what I have always been very reticent in speaking for African Guyanese, because I cannot go into that mindset, because up to now I cannot understand why Sir Arthur Lewis used that word, because I didn't see it. I lived through those years. I didn't see it happening. And so when I come back to Nigel, I think in the African Guyanese intellectual, and Nigel is an intellectual, who are concerned about the African condition. And there are reams of studies that are done to that they are driven to extreme positions. It's like a bear being trapped by one of those, those bear traps, and you eat your own leg to get out of it. So I cannot purport to try to speak for Nigel Hughes, but I can advise him that I think there's a change in Guyana, and he's younger than me, and if I can see that change. Freddie, both my kids went to Queens, right? You know that they both did well by God's grace and all that. 90% of their friends are African Guyanese, and they come out of IFLAT. You understand? All of their friends,
dialectics of left
all of their friends are now either entrepreneurs or professional.
I see it every day in this
because
country.
They chat. Now that cricket is coming next week, they've all made plans to meet at
I've seen that at UG before.
My son would be among all his Afro-Guyanese friends and hanging out at the Amazon Warrior game.
Ravi, do you think, just as how partition has haunted Guyana and will haunt him for the rest of his life, he's 99, do you think that 34 is a majority of 65, not 33? He is now credited as the man who promulgated that and made it into, Sanjeev Dartadin sat in the same seat and said something as absurd as of that enthralled the whole nation. Do you think that will follow him? Everybody talks about him.
Unfortunately so, Freddie, because you see, as an attorney, and I'm a lawyer, I've never practiced, but I'm an attorney, and you're taught in law school that for your client, you look at whatever is out there and you control them a lifeline. To Nigel's credit, he did find a case in some
Vanuatu in South Pacific.
In South Pacific, one of the islands there. And out of that case, he, of course, we would say that he went over the top.
Yeah, but people said in that parliament it was an equal number.
What I'm saying, Freddie, is that in the legal fraternity, sometimes you reach for something for your client. And I can only assume that Nigel did that at a time of desperation from that elements, and Nigel threw that lifeline. But unfortunately, yes, I speak to people call me, and they know I'm very friendly with Nigel, and they feel that will haunt Nigel for the rest of his career. And I say, unfortunately, because he's more than that.
I think he's more than that. He's a personal friend of mine, but we haven't been speaking to each other. I don't socialize. I don't go to the places Nigel would go. I don't go anywhere.
Same here.
I couldn't understand why he went in that direction, because he came across pre-2018, even when the AFC was in power, he came across as your natural multiracial guy who is from the middle class, but he came across as a kind of guard in those days, 1990, the guard people that you had in 1991, 1990. And then I saw this fastening in the company. He would appear with Burke. Now, there's some people you just don't touch because they're very extremist and violent in their rhetoric, and Burke is one of that.
We come back to the point I'm making, Freddie, that when the straits are so dire, as Nigel and others see it in the Afro-Ghanaian community, in a sense that any port in a storm can happen. And I think it's unfortunate. I think, coming back to Mr. Hoyt, I would advise them to look beyond the horizon. Look as to where we can possibly end up, because, I look at it myself. Both my kids are professionals. And when I look at the world, there's a lot of things that I disagree with. For example, corruption. There's no question. And it's been shown in all of our societies, underdeveloped societies, as your old friend Samir, talked about.
Samir
Amin, the whole overdeveloped state.
The overdeveloped state. Yeah. No, it's not he. That was Hamza Alavi, the Pakistani political scientist.
So to come back to the point is then that I think a lot of things will go wrong, but we should expect that, but not overlook them. So I would think, for example, issues like corruption. Indians are very concerned, for example, on the issue of corruption. They are. You get me? They are concerned about nepotism, which is an aspect of corruption. And these are things that you should expect that will happen when money suddenly starts flowing. Capitalism by its nature is crony. Crony capitalism is a tautology. All capitalism, you want to give a contract, somebody, they know about it. So I think these are issues along which people like Nigel Hughes and others can mobilize along. Not this dangerous fissioning of African versus Indian. And I think gradually people can understand that you can come together. And this is not theory, Freddie. We're talking of 2011, when I argued people like you that, we shouldn't go down that road of protests and all that with Kemraj and Eric Phillips and all of them. Let us have a line of, the PNC should rebrand itself, right? And if you remember that phase, you talked about an elective dictatorship and should be taken on, and Eric Phillips and David Hines and so on were on that. But they held their line, played politics on issues, what is called valency politics. And yet, so in 2011, you had the PPP stymied. And 2015, they lost office. So it's not a guessing game we're playing here, Freddie. Regular politics in Guyana. If you don't drive people into the arms of others, they will vote for regular issues. And I think that's what we need today in Guyana. And I hope that Nigel will move along those lines. And I'm hoping that Aubrey will move along those lines.
But is it too late? The elections is just about a year from now.
Well, that is where
The campaign will start somewhere in June.
Well, that's why I think they might have shot themselves in the foot. You know how? Because it's there, and like any reputable political party, the PPP will make hay out of what they did.
Neither Norton nor him. Well, he is a more penetrating national figure than Norton. But neither of the two.
He who?
News.
Okay.
Neither of the two have said anything about the rigged election. And I think Indians would have expected Nigel, because of his commanding stature pre-2015, Indians would have expected him to say something. I mean, the way Dominic Gaskin did, Ian MacDonald. But he has been so far silent on that election. And wouldn't that not resonate among Indian people?
Well, that is where this new politics that I hope is evolving will include political morality. There has to be some kind of, even though people assume politics is amoral, it's not totally so. Even if the morality of politics is expediency, right? At least he should do that, because it makes sense. If you remember when Trotman came out in 2005, I was part of all of us were part of trying to develop, a third force and a center force. And Trotman very clearly said, and one of the things that made him, redeemed, coming out of the PNC, he said the PNC should apologize for its past. A lot of people didn't like it, but we remember that Raphael did a call for the PNC to apologize. And I think we have arrived at a similar moment, that for there to be a new politics and for the AFC to be given some credibility, there is going to be the need for a watershed statement. And I think such a statement might be necessary.
The time is going. The operator told us we got 4 more minutes left. The two laziest analysts in this country, you would be surprised to know who they are. The two laziest analysts in this country. They're sitting right at this table here. And I think of the two of us, I don't know which is the laziest. But Ravi, it's time you write a book, time you write your autobiography.
Well, I'll tell you something. I have written materials that can give.
But why not put
10 books.
Selected essays then?
That is what
people.
As you know, I was medically challenged in the last few months, and I've made a commitment to my own kids that once I get back myself, totally on my own foot, my 2 feet, I'm going to. And many people have encouraged me to do that. Pick them along themes.
No, you have to contribute to Guyanese historiography.
Yes, I'll do that. I promise you, Ferry.
Do it. But our time is not up yet. Do it as selected essays.
Yes.
By Ravi Dev.
Yes.
Selected essays in Guyana by Ravi Dev. So many top intellectuals put their things together.
I'll start with. I've written about 5 quote unquote academic papers. When I analyzed the Burnham regime on the dictatorship. I did about 4 of them. Etiology of an ethnic riot when we launched it.
I have that.
So I have about 5 of those papers. That'll be the easiest thing. Somebody told me, put it together. Just have somebody do a forward to it. And maybe I'll ask you to say a few words about it. It's going to come out.
The need to add to Guyanese historiography. I mean, you'll be missing if you don't.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Right. By the way, I don't know if I'm supposed to say this. I don't think he will object. No, I don't think he will object from speaking in the last time. Kit Nascimento's autobiography should be coming out next year.
Yeah, I heard about it. I know the person who's doing it.
Yeah. Well, we can't say who's that person because he didn't get.
Yeah.
He told me not to say that person's name publicly, but He told me I can say that is.
Yeah.
I think viewers looking at this program will obviously say, with this election in the air and formation, Glenn Lyle has now officially announced he'll be running.
He has?
Yes, he said he's official. I did a column on it.
Okay. How about that?
He announced on his program that he'll be.
How about that?
Then the Starbuck News have given widespread coverage to a group that is being formed, and they said will consist of professionals and all.
I read that.
I think Starbuck News know those people, and that is the mulatto Creole thing. Then Timothy Jonas said they're expecting about 4 seats. And now you have Nigel Hughes. I think most people would say, ask the man what he think about the elections coming up. So I'm asking you.
Well, fortunately, in this new era of instant communications, even though I don't physically travel around the country, people call me all the time from all parts of the country. As you know, I was a member of a coalition with CAP. So I even have contacts in the hinterland, you know. Paul is over in Brazil, but I still have contacts. So I believe that the PPP has given what I call a full court press, worthy of anyone, even LeBron, that they've given full court press in terms of beating the bushes to get the votes out. So even though Indians are probably down to about 35% of the population by now.
It was 39, it gone to
39. I think so, because spending a lot of time in New York, and the wave still goes.
Okay.
It does not diminish. So I think that the PPP will win. I think they will increase their majority, and they will come out victorious, because the kind of politics that the opposition is playing right now, let me be frank about it, is playing into the PPP hands. People want the opportunity to develop themselves.
And look, the latest thing with Figaro, I mean, not this alienating the PNC, but listen, the operator just told me that he don't want to call you an exploiter of labor. Our time has come.
Yes,
Do not go beyond our time, because we exploited our two operators. Yes. Ravi, we have to have you back here again, because there is so much I wanted to ask you on this. I wanted to ask you about the mulatto Creole class and their reaction to the 2020 election and such. So give it 6 weeks and we're back. Look,
yes.
It's up, and I hope you're doing all right with your health.
Yes, I'm working on that. Yeah.
Right, good. Ravi, once again.
Take care.
Nice to have a stimulating intellectual in the program.
Hasta la vista, viewers.
He said it in Spanish. I will say it in Creole. Ravi Dev was our guest this evening. He said, hasta la vista. See you later. Catch you later, man.